The illusion of success. Harold Wainwright was a man who believed deeply in the image he had crafted over the years. At 62, his life was an epitome of refinement, a testament to his years of hard work, determination, and, though he'd never admit it, a fierce ambition to climb his way up from his modest beginnings. Now, the owner of Le Mandor, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, Harold enjoyed all the trappings of success: a grand penthouse, a tailored wardrobe, and connections with influential figures across the city's social spectrum. Le Mandor was his crowning achievement, a sanctuary of fine dining that glowed with the kind of sophistication only money could buy. Nestled in a district reserved for the city's wealthiest residents, Le Mandor was more than a restaurant. It was a curated experience, a symbol of the elite life. Guests who stepped through its doors entered an environment designed to convey opulence and class. The chandelier above the entrance glistened with real crystal, casting prisms of light across polished marble floors. The waiters moved with practiced grace, navigating between tables laden with dishes prepared by top chefs who had once studied in the culinary capitals of the world. Each server wore a crisp black uniform, embodying the elegance Harold required to maintain his brand's aura of luxury. Harold observed his domain with a quiet satisfaction. His graying hair, perfectly styled, lent him a distinguished look, while his sharp eyes missed nothing. Every guest, every plate, every candle flame flickering on each carefully spaced table fell under his meticulous scrutiny. To Harold, Le Mandor was a sacred space, one reserved for those who had earned the right to be there. To protect this sanctum, he insisted on a standard of exclusivity that went beyond simple wealth. It was about appearance, attitude, and understanding the world as he saw it. Tonight was a busy evening, the kind that gave Harold a sense of pride. Seated at tables across the restaurant were businessmen in suits that probably cost as much as the vintage wines they were sipping, socialites in designer gowns, and influencers capturing moments to post on their channels. The quiet murmur of conversation floated through the air, blending with the soft notes of a piano in the corner, creating a background symphony that Harold loved. Here, in his restaurant, he felt powerful, a figure of respect and admiration. As Harold walked past a table where a well-known art dealer sat entertaining guests, he offered a slight nod of acknowledgement. The dealer smiled and raised his glass, a silent toast to their shared status. These were the people Harold respected, those who understood the importance of appearance, status, and success. His gaze lingered on the scene, satisfaction warming him from the inside. This was what he had built, and he would do anything to protect it. Then, as Harold returned to his station by the entrance, a subtle shift in the air caught his attention. A couple had just entered. They were well-dressed, certainly. The man wore a tailored suit that fit him perfectly, and the woman's evening gown shimmered under the restaurant's soft lighting. Still, something about them didn't sit right with Harold. He studied them, his practiced eye searching for imperfections, and then he realized what had caught his attention. They were black. His posture stiffened, and his practiced, welcoming smile faded for just a second. His mind worked quickly, almost reflexively, filing through a list of rationalizations. Le Mandor was a high-standard establishment, he reminded himself. He didn't discriminate. He simply upheld a certain standard. Yet, somewhere beneath that veneer of professionalism, an old prejudice stirred, something he'd inherited from his upbringing, but had never confronted. For a moment, Harold hesitated. Then he stepped forward, adopting his usual controlled expression. The man, who introduced himself as Marcus Daniels, spoke with a polite, confident tone as he requested their table, reserved under Daniels. Harold offered a curt nod, a measured smile masking his growing discomfort. But then his eyes flicked toward the hostess, Kay, who stood nearby, her posture tense as she picked up on the shift in his demeanor. After a moment's pause, Harold responded, "I'm sorry, but I believe there may be some mistake. I don't see a reservation under that name." The couple exchanged a glance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and growing concern. Marcus pulled out his phone, his tone remaining calm as he explained, "I confirmed the reservation just this morning. We were told everything was ready." "I'm afraid there's nothing we can do," Harold replied, his tone dismissive. "Perhaps you would be more comfortable dining elsewhere." Marcus's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Despite the sting of Harold's words, he maintained his composure. "We're here to celebrate our anniversary. We've heard wonderful things about Le Mandor." Harold's gaze hardened as he glanced past them, signaling for Kay to show them the door. "I apologize," he said with a thin smile, "but we have a certain standard to uphold here. I'm sure you understand." For a moment, there was silence as the couple absorbed the sting of his dismissal. Olivia, Marcus's wife, looked as though she wanted to say something, her eyes flashing with frustration. But Marcus touched her arm gently, offering a small, resigned smile as he nodded to her. They turned to leave, their steps slow, dignity intact despite the quiet humiliation Harold had inflicted. As they disappeared through the doors, Harold felt a brief pang of something unfamiliar, an uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He quickly dismissed it, reassuring himself that he had done the right thing. He had kept the restaurant's image pristine. He had protected the sanctity of his establishment. After all, he had a business to run, and he had worked too hard to allow anything to tarnish the reputation he had so carefully crafted. That night, Harold went home to his luxurious apartment, feeling an uneasy satisfaction. He had never considered himself prejudiced. He believed in standards, he believed in exclusivity, and he believed in his right to determine the clientele for his restaurant. To him, the Daniels were merely people who did not fit into his world, a world he had worked his entire life to build and maintain. If they took offense, that was their issue, not his. As Harold lay in bed, his mind drifted back to the couple, and a flicker of doubt crept in, unwelcome and strange. He pushed it away, reminding himself of all he had achieved. He had built this life from nothing, clawing his way to the top. That required hard decisions and sometimes tough actions. That's what success demanded, he thought. But beneath that carefully constructed justification, a seed of unease had taken root, a discomfort that Harold would soon find impossible to ignore. Because what he did not yet realize was that the Daniels were no ordinary couple. In the days to come, their departure from Le Mandor would echo across the city and beyond, exposing Harold's hidden biases and shaking his world in ways he could never have imagined. The walls of his carefully crafted life were about to come crashing down, and Harold Wainwright would be forced to confront a truth he had spent a lifetime denying. The shockwaves. The next morning, Harold arrived at Le Mandor feeling the residual satisfaction of the previous night. He was dressed in his usual tailored suit, exuding an air of control and dignity. However, as he entered, he immediately sensed something was off. The restaurant, usually humming with the soft chatter of staff preparing for the day, was uncharacteristically quiet. His staff avoided his gaze as he walked through the dining room. Even Kay, who usually greeted him warmly, seemed unusually tense, her face pale as she stood by the hostess podium. He was about to ask what was going on when she cleared her throat and spoke, her voice shaky. "Mr. Wright, there's something you should see." Harold frowned, noticing for the first time that Kay looked exhausted, as if she hadn't slept. She held out her phone, and Harold took it reluctantly, a faint sense of foreboding washing over him. The headline on the screen made his blood run cold. "Prominent couple denied service at upscale restaurant. Racism alleged." The article detailed every part of the previous evening, capturing even the smallest nuances of Harold's treatment of the Daniels. The writer did not mince words, describing Marcus and Olivia Daniels as a respected power couple. Marcus was a prominent civil rights attorney, known for his work in high-profile discrimination cases, while Olivia was a celebrated author and social justice activist, well respected in both local and national circles. They were pillars of the community, people whom others looked up to, admired, and followed. The article ended with a call to action, urging readers to boycott Le Mandor in response to what was described as a blatant act of racial discrimination. Harold's stomach twisted as he scrolled down, reading the hundreds of comments that had poured in overnight. People were furious, some sharing their own experiences with exclusion, others calling for protests outside the restaurant. It was clear that his actions had ignited a firestorm of outrage that had quickly spread far beyond his control. "What? How did this happen?" he whispered, more to himself than to Kay. She looked away, discomfort evident on her face. "It was posted on social media last night, and it's been picked up by every major news outlet this morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "People are really upset, Mr. Wright." Harold's mind raced, trying to process the enormity of the situation. He was no stranger to business challenges. He had survived economic downturns, competition from rival restaurants, even a devastating kitchen fire that had nearly bankrupted him. But this was different. This was personal, and it was his own actions that had brought it on. He forced himself to stay calm. He would handle it. He had contacts, people in the media, a PR team on standby. With the right spin, he could manage this. He was Harold Wainwright, after all. He had survived worse. He picked up his phone and called Janet Peterson, his attorney, a sharp-minded woman who had handled all his legal matters for years. Janet answered on the first ring, her tone clipped and businesslike. "I've seen the article," she said before Harold could speak. "We need to get ahead of this, Harold, and quickly." Harold clenched his jaw, resenting the urgency in her voice. "This is being blown out of proportion, Janet. I was simply maintaining the standards of my establishment. You know how important that is to our brand." "Maintaining standards," Janet echoed, her tone incredulous. "Harold, this isn't about a standard. You turned away a prominent black couple on their anniversary. People are calling it racial discrimination, and whether you meant it or not, it's being perceived that way. There are already calls for protests outside Le Mandor. We need to issue a statement, and you need to apologize. Now." Harold bristled at the word. Apologize? He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to build Le Mandor, to let a misunderstanding taint his reputation. In his mind, he wasn't guilty of anything. He had merely enforced the standards that he believed made his restaurant special, but he was starting to realize that not everyone shared his perspective. "I'm not going to issue an apology for something I didn't do, Janet," he replied, his voice cold. "I don't owe anyone anything." "Harold," Janet said, her voice softening slightly, "you don't have to agree with the narrative, but you have to understand that this is about more than just you. This is about perception, and right now, the perception is that Le Mandor is a place where black people aren't welcome. If you don't address this, it won't just be the restaurant's reputation on the line. It'll be yours." For the first time, Harold felt a flicker of doubt. He glanced around the empty dining room, feeling the weight of her words. She was right about one thing. Le Mandor was more than just a business. It was his legacy, his life's work. If that was destroyed, what would he have left? Reluctantly, he ended the call with a promise to handle it, though he didn't yet know how. As he stood alone in the dining room, he became acutely aware of the silence. Usually, the air buzzed with the sound of tables being set and cutlery being polished. Today, the staff worked in tense silence, casting anxious glances in his direction. Harold realized they had all seen the article too, and though none dared to confront him directly, he could sense their judgment, the unspoken questions that hung in the air. Before he could dwell further, his phone rang again. This time, the voice on the other end wasn't a lawyer or a reporter. It was Marcus Daniels. For a moment, Harold considered ignoring the call. He didn't want to talk to Marcus, didn't want to deal with the man who had so thoroughly unraveled his carefully constructed life. But curiosity, or perhaps a deeper sense of dread, compelled him to answer. "Mr. Wright," Marcus said, his tone measured and calm. "I thought it was time we spoke directly." Harold's throat tightened, and he forced himself to respond. "Mr. Daniels," he replied stiffly, "I can assure you, this whole situation has been blown out of proportion." "Blown out of proportion," Marcus echoed, his voice sharp. "My wife and I were denied service at your restaurant for no other reason than the color of our skin. Do you understand what that feels like, Mr. Wright? To be judged, dismissed, without a second thought." Harold's face flushed, and he felt an uncomfortable stirring of something he didn't want to name. Shame. Regret. He buried it quickly, falling back on his well-practiced response. "I don't think it's fair to make this about race, Mr. Daniels. Le Mandor is a high-end establishment. I have the right to determine my clientele." "So you believe that people like me and Olivia don't belong in your establishment?" Marcus's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a weight that made Harold feel small. "What gives you that right, Mr. Wright?" Harold hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to respond. He had always believed that Le Mandor was a place for his kind of people, but he had never questioned what that actually meant. Standing there, listening to Marcus's steady, unyielding voice, he realized that he didn't have a good answer. "I don't owe you an explanation," he said finally, though even he heard the hollow note in his voice. "No, you don't," Marcus agreed, his tone laced with disappointment. "But know this, Mr. Wright. This isn't going to go away. The world is watching, and people won't forget what happened. You can either confront it or let it destroy you." The call ended abruptly, leaving Harold standing alone in the echoing silence of his restaurant, Marcus's words reverberating in his mind. His heart pounded as he looked around, seeing Le Mandor in a new light. The chandeliers, the polished floors, the gleaming silverware, they had once filled him with pride. Now they felt hollow, the trappings of a life built on a foundation he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Outside, a group of protesters had gathered, their voices growing louder as more people joined. Through the windows, Harold could see their signs, some reading "Racism has no place here," while others demanded accountability. His sanctuary, his beloved Le Mandor, was no longer a place of prestige. It had become a symbol of exclusion, and the people outside would not be silenced. Harold paced the dining room, his mind racing. This was his life's work, and now it was slipping through his fingers, being dismantled by forces he couldn't control. For years, he had surrounded himself with wealth and success, convinced that these things made him better than the people he had left behind. But now, as he faced the wrath of a community he had dismissed, he felt his grip loosening, his control slipping. In his desperation, Harold thought of calling his PR firm, of spinning the narrative, of denying, of deflecting. But deep down, he knew that this was bigger than any story he could craft. This was about his identity, his values, his very sense of self. As the day wore on, the protest outside grew. The restaurant's regular clientele had begun canceling reservations, unwilling to be seen in a place now tarnished by scandal. The staff, once loyal and obedient, moved with a tense unease, avoiding his gaze. Even Kay, his most trusted hostess, had become distant, her usual warmth replaced by something colder, almost disappointed. Harold was losing control of the world he had so meticulously crafted, and for the first time, he realized that he couldn't simply buy his way out of this. The fortress he had built around himself was crumbling, and there was no one left to help him. As he stood alone in the empty dining room, Harold felt a strange sense of vulnerability. He had spent his life believing he was better than others, that his success elevated him above reproach. But now, as he looked out at the crowd of protesters, their voices rising in unison, he saw that he was no different from anyone else. In that moment, Harold felt a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. For the first time in his life, he wondered if perhaps he wasn't as righteous as he had always believed. The realization shook him to his core, and he knew that his journey was just beginning. A growing storm. In the days following the protest outside Le Mandor, Harold's life became a whirlwind of unwelcome attention, whispers, and outright condemnation. He couldn't remember a time he had felt so exposed, so vulnerable. As he watched the restaurant he had built from the ground up face public scrutiny, he felt the foundations of his identity shifting beneath him, like sand slipping away. The backlash was unrelenting. Social media was flooded with posts demanding justice for Marcus and Olivia Daniels, and Lamandor was now a trending hashtag, though for all the wrong reasons. People shared the article that recounted every detail of the Daniels dismissal, and the comments were brutal. Former patrons vowed never to return, influencers canceled their dinner reservations publicly, and calls to boycott Lamandor continued to gain momentum. Even some of his long-standing, wealthy clients began to pull away, not wanting to be associated with the controversy surrounding his restaurant. Each cancellation hit Harold like a physical blow. He spent hours in his office, desperately contacting anyone he could think of who might help him weather the storm, from PR firms to socialites who had once sung his praises. Yet the answers were always the same. The tide of public opinion was too strong. This was a fire he couldn't contain, a wave that threatened to engulf everything he had built. One afternoon, he was pacing his office, staring at his phone with a mix of anger and desperation, when he heard a knock on his door. It was Kay, her face tense and serious. "Mr. Wright," she began, her voice hesitant. "We need to talk." Harold looked at her, surprised. Kay had always been loyal, his right-hand woman, someone he trusted implicitly to maintain the high standards of Lamandor. He had handpicked her for her professionalism and her poise, qualities he believed mirrored his own. But as she stood before him now, Harold noticed a new wariness in her eyes, a disappointment that unsettled him. "Of course," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Close the door and sit down." She did as he asked, sitting across from him with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, there was silence between them, a tense pause as if she were gathering her thoughts. Finally, she spoke. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice steady, "I've been with you for a long time. I've seen how much effort you've put into making Lamandor what it is. I know how important this place is to you. But—" she paused, as if searching for the right words. "I think it's time we talk about what happened with the Daniels." Harold's jaw tightened, and he looked away, unwilling to meet her gaze. "There's nothing to talk about," he replied, his voice colder than he intended. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion. I have standards for my clientele, and the Daniels didn't meet those standards. It's as simple as that." "Is it really that simple?" Kay asked quietly, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I was there that night, Mr. Wright. I saw the way you looked at them. You dismissed them before they even had a chance to speak. I can't help but wonder, if they were a different kind of couple, would things have gone differently?" Harold felt a surge of anger at her words. He was not used to being questioned, especially not by someone he had trusted and respected for years. He opened his mouth to respond, but something about the look in Kay's eyes stopped him. She wasn't accusing him. She was pleading with him, almost as if she wanted him to see something he was refusing to acknowledge. "You think I'm a racist, then?" he asked, his voice laced with bitterness. Kay hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but she didn't back down. I think that maybe you've been holding on to certain beliefs for a long time without realizing it. And I think those beliefs have influenced the way you run this restaurant. I'm not saying it's intentional, Mr. Wright, but it's there. And people are seeing it, even if you can't." Harold felt his chest tighten, a mixture of defensiveness and doubt twisting within him. He wanted to dismiss her words, to tell her that she didn't understand what it took to maintain the kind of establishment he had built. But deep down, he knew that Kay was one of the few people in his life who had always been honest with him. She wasn't trying to tear him down. She was trying to make him see something he had spent his life avoiding. He let out a slow breath, the anger draining from his face. "So, what would you have me do, Kay? Apologize? Bow down to the mob outside and tell them they were right?" Kay shook her head. "I think you need to start by being honest with yourself," she replied. "Ask yourself why you turned them away. Was it really about standards, or was it about something else? Until you can answer that question, any apology you give won't mean anything." Harold looked down at his hands, feeling a strange hollowness settle over him. He had spent so long building walls around himself, so long convincing himself that his success and his high standards placed him above reproach. But now, as he sat alone with Kay's words echoing in his mind, he felt those walls beginning to crack. After a moment, Kay stood up, her expression softening. "Think about it, Mr. Wright," she said quietly. "If you're serious about fixing this, it has to start with you." She turned and left the office, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Harold's world took another unexpected turn. As he sat at his desk, staring blankly at his phone, he received a call from Marcus Daniels. "Mr. Wright," Marcus said, his tone calm yet firm, "I'd like to offer you an opportunity to address this situation." Harold's breath caught in his throat. "An opportunity?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "I want you to meet me. Not at your restaurant, but somewhere neutral. I think it's time we have a conversation. A real one. No excuses, no justifications. Just two men talking." Harold's instinct was to refuse, to assert his control, to cling to the authority he had wielded for so long. But something in Marcus's voice stopped him. There was no anger, no accusation, only a calm determination that unnerved Harold. He realized that this wasn't a battle he could win through force of will or clever words. Marcus wasn't offering him a lifeline. He was offering him a chance to confront the truth. "I'll meet you," Harold said, his voice quieter than he intended. They arranged to meet at a small cafe on the edge of town, a humble, family-owned place that Harold had never set foot in. When he arrived, he felt strangely out of place, a man in an expensive suit sitting among patrons in casual clothes, sipping coffee and chatting easily. He spotted Marcus sitting by the window, his expression unreadable as he looked out over the street. Harold walked over and sat down, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was entering a space where he held no power, no control. Marcus looked up, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Wright," he said, his voice calm but measured. "I didn't know if you would." Harold forced himself to meet Marcus's gaze. "You wanted to talk. So here I am." Marcus took a sip of his coffee, studying Harold with a quiet intensity. "Let's start with something simple, then," he said. "Why did you turn us away that night?" Harold opened his mouth, ready to fall back on his usual justifications, standards, image, reputation. But as he looked into Marcus's eyes, he felt those words falter. They felt hollow, shallow, like a flimsy shield against a truth he couldn't ignore. I thought you didn't belong there," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought it would harm the image of the restaurant." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. "And why did you think that, Mr. Wright? What made you look at us and decide we didn't belong?" Harold felt a lump rise in his throat, an uncomfortable knot of emotions he had buried for so long that he no longer knew how to name them. He thought of his upbringing, the values instilled in him by his father, the unspoken lessons he had absorbed as he climbed his way to the top. He had always believed that people were defined by their appearance, their status, their ability to fit into a certain mold. And in his mind, Marcus and Olivia hadn't fit. "I don't know," he said, his voice raw. "Maybe it's how I was raised. Maybe it's the world I grew up in. I never questioned it." Marcus looked at him for a long moment, his expression softened by a hint of understanding. "Mr. Wright, I don't need an apology. I don't need you to tell me you're sorry. But I need you to understand something. What happened that night wasn't just about me or Olivia. It was about every person who's ever been told they don't belong because of how they look, where they come from, or what they believe." Harold swallowed. feeling the weight of Marcus's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. For years, he had seen himself as a man who deserved his success, a man who had earned his place in the world through hard work and determination. But now, as he sat across from Marcus, he realized that he had built his life on a foundation of exclusion, a belief that some people were inherently worth more than others. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," he said quietly, his voice trembling. I thought I was just protecting my business." Marcus nodded. "I believe you," he said. "But protecting your business doesn't give you the right to judge who's worthy and who isn't. That kind of thinking hurts people, Mr. Wright. It builds walls between us, walls that take years to tear down." They sat in silence for a while, each man lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Marcus leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I don't know if you can change, Mr. Wright. That's something only you can decide. But I hope that today is a start. I hope that you'll look at yourself, truly look at yourself, and see the man you want to be, not the man you've been." Harold nodded slowly, feeling the weight of Marcus's words sink into him. For the first time, he realized that the walls he had built around himself were not just barriers to others, but to his own growth, his own understanding of the world. "I'll try," he said, his voice barely audible. "I don't know if I can change overnight, but I'll try." Marcus nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's all anyone can ask, Mr. Wright. Change doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a journey. And sometimes, it's the hardest journey we'll ever take." As they parted ways, Harold felt a strange sense of relief, a quiet hope stirring within him. He knew that the path ahead would be difficult, that he would have to confront the deepest parts of himself and his beliefs. But for the first time, he was willing to face that challenge, to tear down the walls he had built and find a new way forward. And as he walked back to his car, Harold knew that his journey had only just begun. Confronting the mirror. The days following Harold's meeting with Marcus were some of the most challenging of his life. He returned to Le Mandor feeling as though he were carrying a weight he couldn't shed, a heaviness that clung to him with every step. For years, Harold had built a reputation as a man of refined taste, a man who held himself to the highest standards, and he had surrounded himself with people who reflected that same ideal. Yet now, after his conversation with Marcus, he couldn't shake the feeling that those very standards, his pillars of pride and success, were what had led him here, to this crumbling reality he was forced to confront. Inside Le Mandor, the changes were already noticeable. The staff avoided his gaze even more than before, their interactions clipped and formal, lacking the warmth he'd taken for granted. It was as if an invisible wall now separated him from them. Whispers followed him wherever he went. Conversations that once flowed freely among the waitstaff and kitchen staff now quieted whenever he entered the room. One afternoon, he found Kay in the dining area, reviewing the reservations for the evening. She looked up as he approached, her expression neutral, guarded. "Kay," Harold began, feeling a flicker of uncertainty he had never known with her. "I wanted to talk to you about the changes we need to make around here. I've been giving it a lot of thought." Kay closed the reservation book, her face unreadable. "What kind of changes, Mr. Wright?" Harold took a breath, searching for the right words. "I want to make Le Mandor a place where everyone feels welcome. I want to do things differently, starting now." Kay's expression softened slightly, but her eyes remained skeptical. "That's a good start, Mr. Wright, but it's going to take more than just words. People are hurt. They've seen how things are run here, and it's not just the Daniels incident. There's a feeling, a culture, that goes deeper than one mistake." Her words hit him harder than he'd anticipated, like a slap to the face. He had always thought of Le Mandor as a place of class, elegance, and luxury, a beacon for those who had made it in life. But now he wondered how many people had walked through his doors, felt that cold, unwelcoming atmosphere, and left with a sense of rejection or hurt. "What do you mean?" he asked, genuinely curious, though a part of him dreaded the answer. Kay sighed, hesitating for a moment. There's always been a certain vibe here, Mr. Wright. A sense that people have to fit a certain mold to belong. And I don't just mean the guests. Some of the staff have felt it too, especially those who don't fit that image you're so particular about. It's like they're constantly being judged, always one mistake away from being told they don't belong here. Harold looked away, feeling an uncomfortable knot form in his stomach. He thought about the young hostess, a Latina woman he had hired but had consistently scrutinized, his eyes always assessing whether she was refined enough to fit his restaurant's image, or the black sous chef he had hired years ago, a talented man whom he had silently judged for being too casual in his interactions with the waitstaff, his laughter too loud for the somber atmosphere Harold demanded. He realized that he had been creating an atmosphere where people walked on eggshells around him, constantly worried about maintaining his rigid standards. In trying to craft an environment of elegance, he had inadvertently bred an atmosphere of fear and judgment. He swallowed hard, a rush of guilt flooding him. I didn't realize. Kay nodded, her expression softer now. I know you didn't, but that's the problem, Mr. Wright. You haven't been listening. You've only been looking at people, judging whether they fit your idea of what this place should be, without asking yourself what they might need to truly feel like they belong here. Harold nodded, absorbing her words. It was as if she were holding up a mirror, one that reflected the parts of himself he had spent years avoiding. Then I'll start listening, he said finally. And I'll start with you. Help me understand, Kay. What do we need to do? She looked surprised, as though she hadn't expected him to ask that. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she began to speak. Well, for starters, we need to change how we treat people, both the staff and the guests, she said. This isn't just about adding more diverse faces to the restaurant. It's about changing how we see people and why we want them here. You need to make this place feel like it's for everyone, not just a select few. Harold nodded, listening intently. Kay's words felt like a lifeline, a guide through the fog that had clouded his vision for so long. How do we start? He asked, the vulnerability in his voice surprising even him. Kay hesitated, as if weighing her response carefully. For one, we need to bring in people who can help us understand what inclusivity really means. You and I both know we're not experts in this. There are consultants, community leaders, people who can help us break down these walls. We need their guidance if we're serious about making this change. Harold absorbed her words, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the decisions. But now, for the first time, he was being asked to relinquish that control, to listen and learn from people he would have once dismissed without a second thought. He cleared his throat, his voice thick. All right, let's bring in whoever we need. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Kay's eyes softened, and she nodded. That's a start, Mr. Wright. But remember, it's going to be a long road. People don't change overnight. Neither do cultures. If you're serious about this, you have to be in it for the long haul. Her words lingered with him as he left the restaurant that evening, a weight that settled over him like a heavy cloak. He knew she was right. This was just the beginning, and there would be no easy answers, no quick fixes. He had spent a lifetime building walls around himself, and it would take more than a few conversations to break them down. A week later, the first step toward transformation began. Harold had reached out to a diversity and inclusion consultant named Adrienne Cole, a woman with a background in dismantling toxic workplace cultures and fostering inclusive environments. Adrienne was a middle-aged black woman with an authoritative presence, someone who spoke with conviction and an unshakable belief in her work. When she walked into La Mandor, her gaze was sharp, taking in every detail, from the gleaming chandeliers to the carefully spaced tables, her expression giving nothing away. Harold felt a nervousness he hadn't known in years. He had always been the one in charge, the one who dictated the terms. Yet as Adrienne looked at him, her eyes calm and steady, He felt as though she could see right through him, peeling back the layers of his pride and prejudice with a single glance. They sat in his office, a room Harold had always considered his sanctuary. But now, with Adrienne sitting across from him, he felt exposed, vulnerable. "Thank you for coming, Miss Cole," he began, his voice uncertain. I know we have a lot of work to do." Adrienne nodded, her gaze unyielding. "Mr. Wright, I'm not here to sugarcoat things for you. I've reviewed the reports, spoken to some of your staff, and frankly, you have a culture problem that goes beyond one incident. La Mandor is known for being exclusive, yes, but not in the way you intended. There's a sense that only certain people belong here, and that's damaging." Harold nodded, feeling a pang of shame. I see that now." Adrienne leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "But seeing it isn't enough. The fact that you're willing to acknowledge it is a start, but acknowledgement alone won't change anything. I'm here to help you create a foundation for genuine inclusivity, and that means making some uncomfortable changes, not just to the way you operate, but to the way you think." Harold swallowed, his palms sweating as he realized the enormity of what lay ahead. "I'm willing to do what it takes," he said, his voice steadying with a newfound resolve. "Tell me what we need to do." Adrienne studied him for a moment, as if measuring his sincerity. Then she began outlining her plan, a series of workshops and training sessions aimed not just at the staff, but at Harold himself. It was a plan that would require him to confront his own biases, to unlearn the habits and beliefs that had shaped his worldview. It was a process that would be grueling, demanding, and humbling. The first workshop was held in the private dining room, where tables were usually set with fine china and crystal glasses. Now they were arranged in a simple circle, chairs pulled close together to foster an atmosphere of openness and honesty. Adrienne led the session, her voice calm but firm as she guided the staff through exercises designed to help them identify their own biases, to understand the subtle ways in which prejudice could shape their interactions. For the first time, Harold sat among his staff, not as their boss, but as an equal, a participant in the journey they were all embarking on. He listened as his employees shared stories he had never imagined, stories of feeling judged, of being dismissed or overlooked, not just at La Mandor, but in countless other spaces throughout their lives. He listened as Kay spoke about her experience as a woman in a high-end restaurant, how she had learned to put on a mask of cold professionalism to be taken seriously, to avoid being judged by her appearance or dismissed by customers who didn't think she belonged. He listened as Carlos, the sous chef, spoke about his struggles as a black man in the culinary industry, about the countless times he had been told he was too casual or too loud for fine dining, how he had learned to shrink himself, to fit into a mold that was never meant for him. And as he listened, Harold felt something shift within him. He realized that he had spent so long focusing on maintaining his image that he had forgotten the humanity of the people around him, the individuals who had given La Mandor its life, its soul. Adrienne's voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Wright, do you have anything you'd like to share?" He looked up, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. For a moment, he hesitated, the walls he had built around himself threatening to close in again. But then he remembered Marcus's words, the quiet dignity with which he had faced Harold's prejudice, and he felt a surge of courage. "Yes," he said, his voice unsteady but resolute. "I've spent my whole life believing that success was about image, about control. But I realize now that I've been wrong. I see now that I hurt people, that I pushed people away because of my own biases, my own need to control everything. And I'm sorry." There was a moment of silence, a weighty pause as his words hung in the air. Then, slowly, Kay nodded, a small smile softening her face. Carlos offered a brief, encouraging nod, and Adrienne's expression shifted, a hint of approval in her eyes. Harold felt a rush of relief, a sense of acceptance he hadn't realized he had been longing for. For the first time, he felt as though he were truly part of something, not just the figurehead of a high-end restaurant, but a part of a community, a team. As the workshop continued, Harold listened, learned, and began the slow, difficult process of unlearning the beliefs that had once defined him. He knew that this was only the beginning, that he had a long journey ahead. But for the first time, he felt hopeful that he could change, that Le Mandor could change, that perhaps he could become the man he had always wanted to be. Breaking down the walls. As the weeks passed, Harold found himself grappling with a tumultuous mixture of emotions. The changes he was implementing at Le Mandor were challenging his most ingrained beliefs, forcing him to confront the values he had once held so tightly. There was no turning back now. The journey he had embarked upon was reshaping not just his business, but his very identity. The first real test came one evening when an old friend and longtime patron, Robert Hensley, called to reserve a table. Robert was a wealthy real estate developer, a man who had frequented Le Mandor for years, bringing with him a small entourage of powerful business associates. For as long as Harold could remember, Robert had been a pillar of the restaurant's success, a regular patron who appreciated the exclusivity and elegance Harold had so meticulously cultivated. However, Robert was also known for his outspoken views on keeping things traditional, as he often put it, a polite way of saying he preferred to be surrounded by people who looked and thought just like him. When Harold received the call, his initial instinct was to welcome Robert and his guests as he had always done. But a strange discomfort washed over him, a sense of dissonance that he couldn't ignore. The inclusivity changes he was trying to implement were more than just cosmetic adjustments. They were meant to transform Le Mandor into a place that welcomed all people, not just those who fit a narrow definition of worth. And he knew that Robert's presence might undercut everything he was striving to build. The conversation he dreaded came soon after Robert's arrival that night. Harold watched as Robert entered, his tailored suit immaculate, a cigar tucked into his breast pocket. He wore his wealth like a badge, his every gesture radiating an air of entitlement that Harold now recognized with discomfort. Robert spotted him across the room and waved, beckoning him over with a casual flick of his hand. For a moment, Harold hesitated. He knew that once he approached, he would have to confront the very ideals he was trying to dismantle. "Harold, my man." Robert greeted him with a hearty clap on the shoulder. "I was starting to worry you'd gone and changed too much around here. Glad to see you're still keeping things high class." Harold managed a small smile, feeling the weight of Robert's words settle uneasily in his mind. He glanced around the room, noting the changes that had already begun to reshape Le Mandor. Adrienne's workshops had led to an increase in the diversity of their clientele. The restaurant had started to attract a broader array of guests from different backgrounds, filling the dining room with a vibrant energy that had once been stifled by Harold's strict curation. "Robert," Harold began, his voice hesitant, "we're working on some new things here at Le Mandor, trying to make it a place that feels welcoming to everyone." Robert raised an eyebrow, a trace of amusement dancing in his eyes. "Everyone. Isn't that what the chain restaurants are for?" He chuckled, clearly assuming that Harold was joking. "You're not actually serious about this whole inclusivity business, are you?" "Harold, people come here for exclusivity. That's what makes Le Mandor special. You start opening the doors to just anyone, and this place will lose its magic." The words hit Harold harder than he expected. A few months ago, he would have agreed wholeheartedly. But now, as he looked around the room and saw patrons who might not have felt comfortable dining there before, he realized that the magic Robert spoke of had never truly existed. It had been an illusion, a construct of privilege and exclusion. And he couldn't unsee it. "I think you're wrong, Robert," he said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "This place doesn't lose its value because we welcome new people. It gains something. It becomes better." Robert's expression shifted, his brows knitting together in confusion. "Better? Harold, are you hearing yourself? This isn't the Harold Wright I know. What happened to maintaining standards?" "Standards?" Harold echoed, feeling a strange mixture of anger and clarity settle over him. Robert, I'm beginning to realize that the standards I've held so tightly, they've kept people out. They've built walls. And those walls need to come down. Robert's face darkened, his amusement vanishing. I don't know what's gotten into you, Harold, but I don't like it. You built this place on exclusivity, on catering to people who deserve to be here. And now you're talking about opening the doors to everyone. That's not what La Mandor is about. Harold took a deep breath, steadying himself. Maybe it's time that changed. I want this place to be different. I want it to be a place where anyone who appreciates fine dining can feel welcome, regardless of what they look like or where they come from. Robert scoffed, his gaze hardening. Well, I suppose I'll have to find somewhere else then. Somewhere that still values a certain standard. Harold nodded, his heart heavy but resolute. I understand, Robert. You do what you need to do. Without another word, Robert turned on his heel and strode out of the restaurant, leaving Harold standing alone, feeling a strange sense of liberation mixed with sorrow. He had lost a friend, a longtime patron, someone who had supported him in his rise to success. But as he watched Robert disappear through the door, Harold realized that he was ready to leave that part of himself behind too. This wasn't just about changing La Mandor. It was about changing who he was and what he valued. Over the following months, Adrienne continued to lead the staff in a series of workshops, each one peeling back the layers of prejudice, implicit bias, and exclusion that had seeped into La Mandor's culture. These sessions were intense, often uncomfortable, forcing Harold and his employees to confront difficult truths about themselves. Adrienne encouraged the staff to share their own experiences, and soon stories began to emerge, stories that highlighted the unseen challenges they had faced working in a place that had once prided itself on exclusivity. Carlos, the sous chef, shared his experience of feeling out of place, of constantly being told to tone down his natural personality to fit the restaurant's elegant atmosphere. The young hostess, Maria, spoke about how she had felt pressured to wear her hair a certain way, to adopt a look that was more in line with Harold's standards of refinement, standards that felt alien to her heritage. Each story chipped away at the carefully constructed image Harold had built of himself as a fair, discerning man. He began to see how he had contributed to a culture that silenced individuality, that demanded conformity at the expense of authenticity. In one particularly challenging session, Adrienne led the group in an exercise she called the Circle of Exclusion. She asked everyone to stand in a circle and take a step forward each time they had felt excluded or judged based on their appearance, background, or beliefs. One by one, the staff took hesitant steps forward, some moving quickly, others with reluctance, until nearly everyone stood together in the center, a tight cluster of shared experiences and silent burdens. Adrienne turned to Harold, the only one who hadn't moved, his position as an outsider suddenly stark and glaring. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice soft but firm, "why didn't you take a step forward?" He looked around at his staff, feeling a wave of discomfort. I've always seen myself as someone who worked hard to get where I am. I didn't think I needed to. Adrienne's gaze softened, a hint of empathy in her eyes. And that's the difference, Mr. Wright. You've never had to question whether you belonged. You've never had to change yourself to fit someone else's standards. That's a privilege not everyone has had. The words struck him deeply, resonating with a truth he had never confronted. All his life, he had taken his sense of belonging for granted, assuming it was a natural byproduct of his hard work and success. He had never considered that others might not share that privilege, that their paths might be fraught with obstacles he would never have to face. In that moment, something shifted within him, a realization that went beyond the surface-level understanding he had begun to develop. He saw, with a new clarity, that the culture he had created at La Mandor was not one of refinement, but of exclusion, of reinforcing the very walls he had once believed were necessary to maintain his success. After the session ended, Harold remained behind, lingering in the empty dining room. He felt as though a weight had been lifted, replaced by a new sense of purpose. The journey he had started was far from over, but for the first time, he felt as though he understood the path ahead. As the weeks continued, Le Mandor began to transform. The menu was redesigned to incorporate a broader range of cuisines, reflecting the diverse backgrounds of the staff who had contributed so much to the restaurant. Carlos was given the freedom to experiment, adding dishes that celebrated his cultural heritage, flavors that had once been dismissed as too bold for the restaurant's refined palate. The atmosphere shifted too. The rigid, formal ambiance that had once dominated was replaced by a warmth, a vibrancy that felt welcoming rather than intimidating. Adrian had worked with the staff to create new training programs, focusing on empathy, respect, and understanding. And as the staff embraced these changes, they began to feel a sense of pride in their work, a connection to Le Mandor that went beyond simply being an employee. News of the restaurant's transformation spread, and soon new patrons began to fill the dining room. A mix of people from all walks of life, drawn not only by the fine dining, but by the inclusivity that now defined the establishment. The once exclusive restaurant had become a symbol of change, a place where people from all backgrounds could come together, united by a love of good food and a respect for one another. One evening, as Harold stood by the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Marcus Daniels, his expression calm as he entered with Olivia at his side. They had not returned to Le Mandor since that fateful night, and Harold felt a surge of emotion as he saw them again. He approached them, his heart pounding. "Marcus, Olivia," he said, his voice unsteady. "Thank you for coming back." Marcus looked at him, his gaze thoughtful. "We wanted to see if things had truly changed." Harold nodded, a soft smile touching his lips. "I hope they have, and I'm still working on it, every day." Olivia smiled, a hint of warmth in her eyes. "Then maybe this is a good place to start again." Harold felt a sense of relief, a quiet joy that went beyond words. As he guided them to their table, he looked around the restaurant, taking in the laughter, the conversations, the vibrant energy that filled the room. The walls that had once defined his world were gone, replaced by something far richer, far more meaningful. In that moment, he knew that he had found something he had spent his life searching for. He had found a purpose beyond prestige, a legacy built not on exclusion, but on connection, understanding, and respect. And as he stood among his guests, Harold felt, for the first time, truly at home. A legacy reclaimed. 6 months had passed since Harold's world had begun its transformation. Le Mandor was no longer the same restaurant it had once been, and Harold was no longer the same man. The evolution had not come easily. There had been resistance, doubt, and moments when he questioned if he was truly capable of change. Yet, as he stood in the restaurant's newly remodeled dining room on a warm evening, Harold felt a peace he hadn't known before. Tonight was special, not just because the dining room was filled with the familiar buzz of happy guests, but because Le Mandor was hosting its first community event, a collaboration with local organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion. This event was the culmination of months of hard work and collaboration between Harold, his staff, and leaders in the community who had come together to make Le Mandor a place where everyone felt they belonged. It was a night that marked not only the restaurant's renewal, but Harold's commitment to leaving a different legacy, one built on connection rather than exclusion. As Harold walked through the dining room, he marveled at the changes. The once rigid monochrome decor had been replaced with vibrant artwork from local artists, reflecting the diverse cultural backgrounds of the community. The menu now included a fusion of cuisines, dishes inspired by Latin American, African, and Asian flavors, carefully crafted by Carlos and the kitchen staff, who had been given the freedom to experiment and celebrate their roots. The servers moved freely, their expressions warm and unguarded, their laughter blending with the sounds of a jazz band playing in the corner. It was the kind of energy Harold had once considered unrefined, something he would have dismissed as unsuitable for the elegant image he had clung to so tightly. But now, as he observed his guests, a mix of young professionals, families, artists, and even former patrons who had returned out of curiosity about the restaurant's transformation, he realized that Le Mandor had finally become something real, something honest. It was a place where everyone felt they belonged, a gathering space that celebrated the richness of diversity rather than stifling it. As he made his way toward the back of the dining room, Harold spotted Adrienne Cole, the consultant who had helped guide him through the painful process of change. She stood beside Kay, engaged in conversation, and when she saw Harold approaching, she smiled, a glint of pride in her eyes. "Mr. Wright," Adrienne greeted him, her tone warm. "I have to say, tonight is remarkable. You should be proud." Harold felt a surge of gratitude and humility. "Thank you, Adrienne," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I wouldn't be here without you, without all of you. I owe so much to this team." Adrienne glanced around the room, her expression thoughtful. "Pride is good, but remember, the journey doesn't end here. Change is a commitment, a choice you make every day. There will always be people who resist it, who test it. But I can see that you're in this for the long haul, and that's what matters." He nodded, her words sinking deep. The process of reimagining Le Mandor had opened his eyes to the complexities of inclusivity, of recognizing and valuing the humanity in others, especially those he had once dismissed. He knew now that change was not a destination, but a continuous journey. There would always be more to learn, more growth to pursue, and he was finally ready to embrace it fully. As they spoke, Kay approached him with a smile. "Mr. Wright, there's someone here to see you." Harold turned to see Marcus Daniels standing near the entrance with Olivia, their faces alight with the same calm dignity he remembered from that first night. His heart leaped. He hadn't known if they would return, and seeing them there filled him with an overwhelming sense of gratitude and relief. "Marcus," Harold greeted him warmly as he approached. "Thank you for coming. It means more than you know." Marcus extended his hand, a gesture that felt almost ceremonial, and Harold took it, feeling the weight of forgiveness and understanding in that single handshake. "It's good to see the change," Marcus replied, his voice steady but kind. "To see that you followed through, that you made this place something better." Harold glanced around the room, feeling a swell of pride mixed with humility. "I couldn't have done it without you. You made me see myself, made me confront things I didn't want to face. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Olivia stepped forward, a warm smile on her face. "We're all just here to do our part, Harold. And tonight, it's clear that you've done yours." They moved to a table, and Harold insisted on sitting with them for a drink, eager to hear their thoughts about the new Le Mandor. As they talked, he found himself laughing with them, sharing stories, and learning more about their lives, their passions and their work. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to maintain a mask of formality or control. He was simply Harold, a man sharing a moment with people he had come to respect deeply. As the evening wore on, the event's main speaker took the stage. It was Carlos, the sous chef who had become the heart of the kitchen, a man whose culinary talent had flourished since being given the freedom to bring his own heritage into his work. Carlos had been nervous about speaking, but he'd agreed to share his journey in front of the assembled guests, and as he stepped up to the microphone, a quiet settled over the crowd. "Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight," Carlos began, his voice strong despite his nerves. "Le Mandor has been my workplace for years, but it's only recently that it's begun to feel like my home. This place, once so distant and cold, has become a place of warmth and connection, a place where I can bring my whole self, my culture, my passion. I want to thank Mr. Wright, my colleagues, and everyone who has supported this journey of change. This isn't just a restaurant anymore. It's a community." Applause broke out, and Harold felt a wave of pride and emotion well up within him. He saw the smiles on his staff's faces, the approval of the guests, the unity that filled the room. For so long, he had believed that creating a high-end establishment required exclusivity, the power to decide who was worthy of entering his domain. Now he realized that true success was not about separation or control, but about connection, about bringing people together, honoring their stories, and creating a space where everyone could feel at home. When the applause died down, Marcus turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, Harold. But tell me, what's next? What will you do to keep this place growing, to ensure that it remains what it's become tonight?" Harold considered the question, recognizing its weight. "I think the most important thing I can do is continue listening," he said, his voice steady. "I've spent my whole life building walls, controlling my environment, but now I know that real leadership is about connection, about creating a space where everyone has a voice. I'm committed to that, and I'll keep learning, keep growing." Marcus nodded, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "Then you're on the right path. Just remember, it's a journey without an end. There's always more to learn, more walls to break down." As the evening wound down, Harold found himself standing alone at the entrance, looking out over the dining room. He thought about the years he had spent here, the countless nights he had stood in this very spot, ensuring that every detail was perfect, that his vision was upheld. Yet, for all his attention to detail, he had never truly seen the people who had walked through his doors. He had been blinded by his own ambition, his own fear of letting go, and in that blindness, he had created a world where only certain people felt welcome. But now, that world had changed. The walls had come down, replaced by bridges that connected him to others in ways he had never imagined. And as he looked out at the people gathered in his restaurant, people of all backgrounds, ages, and walks of life, Harold felt a sense of peace that went beyond anything he had ever known. In the weeks that followed, Le Mandor continued to evolve. Harold and his team established new partnerships with community organizations, creating job training programs for young people from underrepresented backgrounds who wanted to pursue careers in fine dining. They hosted events that celebrated cultural heritage, inviting local artists and musicians to showcase their work. Every change, every addition, was a step toward making Le Mandor a place that reflected the diverse beauty of the world beyond its walls. Through it all, Harold remained committed to his own growth. He attended workshops and seminars, learning about systemic inequalities and the ways in which businesses could foster inclusion. He continued to meet with Adrian, who had become both a mentor and a friend, guiding him through the complexities of dismantling the biases he had held for so long. He engaged with his staff on a personal level, learning their stories, understanding their struggles, and celebrating their victories. And in doing so, he found himself becoming a part of the community he had once held at arm's length. One afternoon, as he walked through the city, he came across a group of young people sitting outside a coffee shop, laughing and talking. Among them was a young man wearing a t-shirt that read, "Everyone belongs." The words struck him, resonating with a depth he hadn't expected. For so long, he had believed that belonging was something people had to earn, something granted only to those who met a certain standard. Now, he understood that belonging was a birthright, a fundamental part of being human. As he walked away, Harold felt a warmth in his heart, a sense of purpose and fulfillment that he had once believed could only be found in status and success. He had reclaimed his legacy, not as a man who ruled over an exclusive empire, but as someone who had built a place of welcome, a place where people could come together and find common ground. Le Mandor would always be his pride and joy, but it was no longer a monument to his ambition. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the power of transformation, and a reminder that change was possible for anyone willing to face their own reflection and take the first step. And as Harold looked out over the city, he knew that his journey was far from over. There were still walls to break down, still lessons to learn, and still bridges to build. But he was ready, finally and fully, to face whatever lay ahead. For the first time in his life, Harold Wainwright felt truly, deeply at peace.